My God.
Yeah. Were you taking game development or something, or what were you taking?
Computer science.
Computer science. Yeah, I took game development, so we had to do a little bit of calculus, but just a very small amount, just for like collision detection and stuff. But we had to do quaternions and things like that to like move things and rotate things and stuff. That was all really tedious. I was terrible at math. I was terrible at math in school. I was terrible at math in university.
I like math in high school, but I get to math in university. Where can I use this?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Why am I expanding the effort?
Yeah. All right, I guess we might as well get started. I have a couple of little like housekeeping things to talk about. Not sure if you guys like actually pay attention to what happens on Blackboard. I don't know if I released an announcement. Probably not. I usually write it in Slack, and then that's it. Then I don't write it anywhere else. So if you're not on Slack, I would definitely recommend joining the Slack channel because you'll get more up-to-date information. Yeah. The due date for the lab, I'm not sure if you noticed, it was extended to the 14th, mostly because this weekend is Thanksgiving. I'm not going to make it due on the 7th, or you'll have angry family. So I pushed it to October 14th, which is next week, on Sunday by 11:59. I don't recommend doing it Saturday or Sunday at 10. I definitely recommend jumping ahead based on the issues that some people have had. Yeah, it would be definitely a good idea to start a little earlier. That being said, if you have a lot of JavaScript experience, you could probably complete it in an hour. Yeah, it just depends on how confident you are, I guess. All right. The assignment also was moved because I realized the assignment date was a little bit ridiculous. I had it due on the 7th. That doesn't even follow the syllabus. It's supposed to be due on the 21st. So that's the week of the midterm. So the same week of the midterm, that Sunday, you have to have your assignment in. Yeah, and that's basically it. Plus, you want to study for your stuff and everything else. How many of you have already completed your assignment? One person? Cool. How many of you completed the lab? How many are like struggling with the lab? No? Don't want to admit it? All right, no worries. Today, this lesson, I want to try to see if I can get this lesson done within 2 hours. It's not bloody likely. It'll probably be closer to 2 hours and 15 minutes or so, but I don't mind staying a little bit later to help out with labs and assignments. We'll even pull the lab up and we'll talk about it a little bit. And if there's any struggling points, things like destructuring or anything like that, we'll talk about it. But yeah, other than that, today is functions. We're going to learn about functions today. So why don't we go to week 5 under weekly learning, and let's pull down the first one, which is the library functions. Go ahead and pull that down to wherever you save your lessons. I'm just going to throw it right on my desktop.
Sorry, which one are we opening?
Library functions. I'm going to get rid of that zip file. Open the folder. Open a new tab over here. And then in my browser, open the index file. And if you got it all loaded up correctly, you should see this wonderful little picture here. I've had a couple of messages asking me if we're going to learn any CSS. You guys did have CSS, right? Like a couple semesters ago?
Yeah, we had HTML, JavaScript, and CSS.
Right. Did you just glaze over CSS, or did you guys actually like get right in there and like int
right
child and stuff like that? Okay. The only reason I'm asking is because like CSS is one of those things like it's better to practice than to actually have a full lesson teaching you and losing out on a lesson of JavaScript just to learn CSS. So if you do need CSS support at all and you're having difficulty with your CSS in any way, feel free to just send me a message on Slack. I've been pretty good. I've been responding within about a 2-hour window. I will respond and try to assist you. Now, if you send it to me at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're on your own. But when I wake up and I see that message and I'm drinking my coffee, I'll likely respond. It might be a little too late then, but that's the way it goes. All right, let's open up the HTML file real fast. This is another thing a few people have had some issues with. I've gotten a lot of questions about what some of these things are. Can you see that all the way back there? Yes? Cool. Hard to see for you. Good? Better? Got it. All right. HTML, you guys have learned about HTML, right? You took it. You guys know it's XML based? Yeah, I figured you would. It's XML based. Same like, so when you see XML, yes, it looks like the same structure. It's a way of being able to pass documents through the net. It's one of the oldest transfer languages that we have. It's existed since the beginning of the net. And the whole purpose of it is basically to describe a document. That's the purpose of HTML, right? In JavaScript, we use this thing in order to hijack different elements on the page and give them some functionality and some kind of coolness, right? But let's break down what basically happens. The top part is our doc type, which basically tells the browser what type of HTML document we're using. That doc type is explicit to one particular HTML version. Does anybody know which HTML version it is? Yeah, 5, exactly. That's the doc type for HTML5. That's what we're using in this class exclusively is HTML5. I'm not going to use HTML 4.0 or 4.1 strict or anything like that. The web has been in 5 for the last, well, since I took web development, which was in 2012. So yeah, I think we're far enough ahead that we can just stay explicitly with 5. The next part is the HTML tag, very important tag that describes to the browser that this is an HTML document. The language is an attribute that you can provide. It's totally up to you, but it does give the browser some information about what language you are writing your document in. If you change that from EN to any of the other ones, FR or anything like that, then it tells you, it's French or whatever you want, Spanish or whatever. And then that gives the browser information. Chrome will use that to decipher what translation you may want, right? So it will take a look at it and say, oh, it's English, but your browser's currently set to Spanish. So here, I'm going to suggest that I translate the page for you. The head gives a lot of valuable information as well. This stuff is not rendered though, right? Like the head doesn't actually get rendered to the page inside the browser. The head's purpose is to include important documents like, for example, our styling sheets that we want to include. In this particular scenario, we're including Bootstrap and Font Awesome. Bootstrap is a styling framework that a lot of people use, built by Twitter. Its whole purpose was never really intended to be for design use. That wasn't its purpose. Its purpose was a prototype. It was made to help with prototyping because they were sick of Twitter developers giving them things that look like crap. So they built Bootstrap and said, here, attach this to everything you build. That way, when you give us prototypes, they're usable and they look nicer, right? So that was its original purpose, but now everybody uses it for literally everything. And it's so easy to tell, right? You can always tell when a page is made with Bootstrap. It's always got those rounded buttons. Jumbotrons look exactly the same. Modals look the same. You'll always know when it's Bootstrap. I tend to always know when it's WordPress, too. WordPress has that same kind of format. It really stands out. Font Awesome is very cool. Font Awesome is a huge library of glyphs or icons. The cool thing about Font Awesome is those icons are actually a font. They're not SVGs, they're not PNGs. They are a font, which means you can treat them like a font, right? Which is very awesome because you can use them as content pieces. They load extremely fast. They're very lightweight. And the ones from Font Awesome are all flat design. They're really nice. They're very recognizable. And we were using a CDN to load them because the CDN is included in so many things. You very likely have it in your cache already anyways, which improves on our rendering time. The last thing there where we have custom CSS, that's our style sheet that we're loading in, okay? The head is not required, believe it or not. It's not required. In fact, for a valid HTML page, you must have the HTML tags and a body tag. That is required. That's it. The head is suggested, obviously, because you want a title for your page, you want things like that. So we usually include the head and the body so we have more information for the browser. Why don't we edit our title, because right now it doesn't have a title. I'm just going to call this library functions and save it. After the head, we have the body tag, like I said. The body is what gets rendered to the screen. Most of the tags in the body get rendered to the screen. Tags that don't get rendered are like script, right? Script doesn't get rendered to the screen. That's where we put our JavaScript. The template tag doesn't get rendered to the screen. That's meant to just basically encapsulate a chunk of HTML that you can now use in other areas. That doesn't get rendered. Any style tags that you put in there, though you don't generally put style tags in the body, but if you did, those style tags are not rendered either. They just tell the browser more information. Everything else is rendered, right? Divs are rendered, sections, headers, H1s through to H6, paragraph tags, image tags, they're all rendered. Anchor links, rendered, right? Inside this particular one, we have a div called container. We have two boxes, a start div, a finish div, and then a button called go. All of that block is going to be rendered. The class container is a class that's built into Bootstrap that basically takes all of our page, adds 15% margins on the left and the right, as long as it doesn't exceed 1200 pixels, and then centers the whole thing in place. I'm kind of breaking that with the styling that I've been using. If we move this over, I'm actually using absolute positioning. Absolute positioning takes your element right out of the DOM, and it now floats. And you can move it around wherever you want. And I've basically set up my GUI using absolute positioning. You can see that if you open up the styles, styles.css, everything in here is currently positioned absolute. But like I said, this is not a CSS class, this is a JavaScript class. Any questions about HTML? Cool, we just did like a year's worth of HTML in 15 minutes. Let's move to main.js. All right, today we're going to talk about functions. The first functions we're going to talk about are library functions, right? Custom functions are the ones you make. Library functions are the ones that are built in. Incidentally, all functions that we're going to use here are technically not functions. They're technically methods because they're all coming from the window object, right? The cool thing about it is that it's kind of implied. Any function we call that is built in, if we use its keyword in order to fire it off, it's implied that we're firing it off the window object. So we don't need to type window dot and whatever the function name is. We can get away with just typing the function name in raw, which is awesome. Just keep in mind, though, that that's really the big difference. Everybody's like, well, functions and methods are the same. Technically, under the hood, when you look at the C++, yes, they are basically constructed the same. However, a method, the difference between a method and a function is a method is namespace to an object, right? A function is usually something that is globally accessible by other things within that scope. They aren't generally namespaced. They're keyworded, but they're not namespaced. Anyways, let's move on to using one of our first ones. We're going to use one of the built-in casting functions. So let's create a string first. So we'll say let string to num equal 256 in quotes. Even though it's a number, is it a number? In the world of computers, no, it is not. It is not a number in the world of computers. That is a string. It's fine, though, because in JavaScript, I can still perform math on that, as long as I don't want to add it to anything. The second I want to add it to something, it's going to call to string on whatever I'm trying to add it to, and we're going to wind up with concatenation. We can see that if I say plus 25, right? Which would equal what, 281? That should be 281, but it's not going to be that, because if I console.log that out, our string to num, open up our wonderful console window. Come on, there we go. I'll zoom it up a bit and refresh. We can see that does not equal 281. We're not creating new math. This isn't new math. This is concatenation at its worst, right? The funny thing is if I multiply it, that actually commits a multiplication and gives me the result of that multiplication expression. But the second we add this stupid plus sign in, all hell breaks loose, and we wind up with concatenation. So what do we do? Because this is a common thing that will happen. Any input we get from the browser, from the user's input, comes back as a string. Even if they type a number into the input field, it comes back as a string. We always get strings. That's all we get from the browser is strings. We can't get a physical number out of the browser unless we do some magic on the front end, like add it as a data attribute, or unless we're using Node, right? If we're using Node on the back, and we're using JavaScript on the front, and we've got a nice, beautiful mean stack going, then yeah, everything kind of transfers the way we're expecting it to. But in this scenario, no, sorry, everything's a string. Which means knowing how to cast this is a really important thing, so you don't wind up with weird concatenation. And to cast this, we use the window method called number. Number takes that string, immediately converts it into a number, if it can be. Now when we refresh, we should get 281, which we do. Does anybody know what happens if we do something like this? Anybody want to take a guess at what number will return if it's not actually a number in there? Yeah.
Would it convert it to ASCII by any chance?
You would hope, but no. Yeah, no, that would be nice if we just basically got the ASCII values of each one of the characters back and then we could just sum it together or something. But no, unfortunately, it does not do that. Anybody else want to render a guess?
I actually did it, so it's not fun of the counts.
Right, and what did you get?
Nah.
Yes, you get nan. So not a number is what you wind up getting. So if I refresh, we get nan. We can actually detect for nan using a method called isNan to see whether or not our result is not a number. That's what nan stands for. Nan exists in all languages. You will see it from time to time. Now you know what it is. All right, let's change that back so this thing works properly. Let's go the other way. Let num2 string equals 67. Console.log num to string. That's fine. So if I refresh, I get 67, right? That makes sense. It is a number. But if I want to convert it to a string for whatever reason, maybe I want to concatenate it to something, though if I concatenate it, it will immediately be called convert to string. Like it will call it automatically on it. But I can force it. I can write string around it. That's now converted to string. Though literally the only time I've ever done this is for this class. I don't think I've ever called it ever because it happens automatically on its own. If I refresh, we still get 67. There's no handy quotes. There's nothing to tell you that that is a string. Does anybody know the operator I can use to tell what data type I'm using? Type of, that's right. So right in front of the console, like just right in front of num to string, type the word type of. You can treat it like a function if you want to, and wrap the variable in parentheses. You are welcome to do that, but generally it's written this way. It is considered an operator. In C++, they have a type, it's not type of, it's like type ID, I think it is. And then they also have a size of operator, same kind of idea. Yeah.
Is it just me, or are they different colors as well?
They are. And my syntax highlighting type of is blue. It's actually the same color as the equal sign, which makes sense because they're both operators.
In the console.
Yes, they are. The 281 is blue and the 67 is black. So I'm going to save this, refresh, and now it tells us that this is a string. And we can do the same thing in front of string to num as well. We can type of in front of it, hit refresh, we get number and string. I'm not sure if I showed you this, but console.log can take a list of things. You can do it in a few different ways. I've seen some people basically embed concatenation in there. Don't do that. That's annoying because if you do that, what happens is it converts everything to a string and spits it back out. So if you have an object in there that you want to actually see the properties and methods of that object, then you can't because you called to string on it, right? So now it's gone. The object properties and methods, you can't see them. So the easier way to do it is actually provide a comma and then write string to num. And we'll do the same thing for num to string. Now if we refresh, we get number, and we also get back our actual value. We also have console.dir as well, which we looked at a couple weeks ago. Console.dir in Chrome will actually make sure you get back the object itself with all of its properties and functions so you can look at it. Console.log, depending on what object you're providing it, might cast it automatically to string and spit it out as a string. We notice this when we try to spit out HTML elements. That's usually when we get that issue. All right, let's go to step 2. Any questions about the number casting or the string casting? No? Okay. Let's go to step 2. Now I've commented these out and then didn't realize I commented them out, so I forgot to remove them. So why don't we just uncomment? No, we'll type it out. Why not? Let's go alert. Welcome to the game. I commented these out because they get very annoying after a while, right? They just keep popping up and you have to keep canceling them out. Alert is on the window object as well. And just to demonstrate that what I'm saying is correct, I can type it like this as well, window.alert. Okay? Alert is a method that is on the window object. It is implied that it's on the window object if I just call alert by itself. All right? So if I refresh, I get the alert. The page says, welcome to the game. Can I style that alert box? No. Ooh, why can't I style that alert box? Do I own it?
Because that is not part of document.
Exactly. It's the browser's. The browser owns this. That's why, depending on the browser you're calling this in, it will render differently. If you render it in Safari, it won't necessarily look the same. If you render it in Firefox, it will look different as well. Just depends on what browser you're using. You can't touch any of the alert, confirm, or prompt boxes. You can't modify the download box. You have no control over those things. You can't hijack those things. And obviously for security reasons, right? You imagine if you could control or access the download box when somebody opens it with JavaScript? Yeah, your porn's gone. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. Anyway, so you have no control over that type of stuff, but that's fine. That's why a lot of people don't tend to use them. Like I said, this is implied, so we can actually knock window dot off. This will still work without issue. We have a few more besides alert. Alert's purpose is basically to notify the user that something is up, right? Some browsers, if you call alert multiple times, it gives them the option to disable it. That tends to be why if you really need to pass a notification message, in many systems they call it a flash notification message. If you need to pass a notification, you should likely either build your own notification system using modals or whatever you need so that you can guarantee the user sees what they need to see, not rely on the alert box. The alert box is crap. Okay. Same thing with this guy. It's the confirmation. So this actually returns a value though. So we'll catch it and store it in a confirmation variable. The confirmation takes one argument and it's just a string. Usually it's a question. It doesn't have to be a question, but usually it's a question. Do you like the game? Now that I have it, I might as well do something with it. So I think the best thing to do is to show you what it actually returns. So let's do console.log, and we'll use our list. The first thing we'll do is type of with the operator confirmation. And then the second one will spit out what the value of confirmation is. Anybody want to take a guess at what type of confirmation will return? Yeah, how many of you say Boolean? How many of you say string? Or number? Cool, you're all right. Those of you that answered. Refresh. Welcome to the game. You can see why this gets annoying. Do you like the game? I'm going to say no. And I get a Boolean of false. If I do it again, only I'm going to comment out alert so it doesn't go off again. If I refresh, do you like the game? I already did that one. I need to do the other one. Okay. It's like my go-to. Hit cancel. Hit cancel on everything. I'm so used to just hitting the negative of every single thing that pops up in my browser. All right, Boolean true. Again, though, you can see the annoyance, right? Because the user has to deal with this thing when it pops up. They can't get past it. They have to actually deal with it. That's why when they get the option to disable them, some take it. Some absolutely take the option to disable them. So let's comment those out so they don't pop up again. Under step 2C, we have one more to deal with. This one is called prompt. We'll catch the result into a variable called response. Prompt. Prompt can be anything you want. Enter your name, do whatever. I'm going to say, how often do you play games? Console.log. I'm going to say type of, response, and response. And this is one of those reasons why these little confirm, alert, and prompt boxes aren't necessarily the best, especially prompt. Prompt, you can't guarantee the return value because there is possibly 2 data types that can be returned from prompt, which is kind of annoying. So let's demonstrate. So first of all, if I refresh, I'm going to press 6. What do you think my data type is going to be from that? How many people say string? How many people say number? Cool. You guys have been practicing. I'm going to hit OK. Sure enough, I get string 6, right? Because everything that comes from the browser comes back as a string, unless you have some good interpolation between the two. Going to refresh again. This time I'm going to click cancel, and you'll notice in documentation it says everything that returns back from prompt is a string, but that is not accurate, because if I hit cancel, I get an object null, and that's because null is an object. It is not a string. Okay? So that's one thing you have to interpret, that if you are expecting a string back at all times with prompt, that's not necessarily a guarantee. You might get an object back, so you need to be cautious of those things. In fact, just don't use them. There's really no reason. The only one I ever use, to be honest with you, is confirm. And the only time I use confirm is if they are deleting something. If they are deleting something, then I make sure they want to do that for sure. And then if they do, they hit OK. Then I allow things to happen. The only reason I do that is because you can easily disable JavaScript. So modals won't necessarily work in that scenario. I can't stop them from moving on, but confirm does. Confirm is not JavaScript bound. It stops the user. It stops the world from moving forward. If they hit cancel, it will cancel. It won't send out any post requests. It won't send anything out. It stops them from moving forward. So you can see the importance of things like confirm. All right, step 2D. Let's make sure you comment all those ones out. Otherwise, they're going to pop up every single time. Hence step 2D, which says comment out the above code to avoid it calling each time. All right, step 3. Cool. We're going to look at parsing functions. So we just looked at casting, which is string and number. They allow us to cast. We have another casting type called parse. Parse is a little different. We have 2 different types. We have Parsefloat and Parseint. Parsefloat will actually parse a value into a float value, whether it's a string or whether it's a number. It will parse it as a float. If it's Parseint, it will parse it as an integer. If you give it a string, it will pull the integer out. If you give it a float, it will truncate anything after the decimal place. That's important to understand the difference between truncate and round. Truncate means it still technically exists in the real world, but you're not going to see it because I'm just going to cut it off. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm just going to knock it off. So you got to keep that in mind. It's almost like flooring. No, I don't even know if floor would be the accurate one. Yeah, I would say it's closer to floor. Yeah. Okay, step 3. Let float equal, and let's put this in nice quotes. Float is equal to parse float, spelled correctly. Then let's console.log, type of float, float. What will type of be equal to? How many people say float? How many people say number? Right? The wonderful world of JavaScript where we don't get any other thing but numbers. Yeah. But parse float exists for some bizarre reason. Yeah. So that's cool. So we've got our float out of the string. That's really no different than if we were to call to number on it, right? It's the same basic thing. However, you do get some other pieces. So if I do float equals 3.14 things. Call float equals parse float. Nope, not that. Parse float. Float. And then I'm going to be lazy and just duplicate this and move it down. What happens this time is the parser actually takes a look at it and it grabs the numbers and returns them. It will truncate anything after the numbers. So if I refresh, we still get number 3.14, but things has been completely truncated from the expression, right? So you would think, in all honesty, you would totally think that you could do something like this. Float equals, I have 3.14 things. I'm just going to duplicate these two things, move them down, like so. And the way I'm doing that, in case you're curious, if you're on a Mac, it's Command-Shift-D to duplicate, probably Control-D if you're on any other device and you're using Sublime. To move things up and down, I hit Command to Control. I believe Ali from the other class said it's Control-Alt will do the same thing. Allow things to move up and down. I'm not sure, though. I would definitely learn how to use your IDE. Now, if I refresh, I get not a number. The reason why I get not a number is because the parser will only parse till the first instance of something that isn't a number. Okay, that's very important to understand. Not a number. So when it hits it, it goes, yep, I give up. All done. Return back nan. That's what you get. So if you have the number at the beginning of it, you're fine because it will parse it and return it. But if you don't, it will just, return back not a number. Yeah.
Non-number is a number though. Or is it not a number?
Not a number is not a number. No, not a number is a number, according to the parser. According to type of. Yeah, because we did type of. Not a number is a number. Isn't that ironic?
And not a number is not equal to not a number. So if you say not a number triple equals not a number, it gives you false. No, like triple equals.
That's even better. So not a number cannot equal not a number. Isn't that funny? Jeez, JavaScript. All right, so in addition to float, we also have integer, right? Integer is pretty easy to work with. So if we do, let's do let integer equal 3.14. Yes, I know that's not an integer. Integer equals parse int. We'll pass it integer. Then we'll console.log it out with type of integer, comma, integer. Anybody want to take a guess at what it's going to return? From this side. 3? How many people say 3? Oh, not very many. Okay, let's refresh. Sure enough, we get 3. Now it's not rounding, it is not flooring, it is not ceiling. It is not doing anything to that number except for literally truncating everything off the 0.14. How many of you have used C++ or C? A few of you? Yeah, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you define a number as a float and then you try to store that float into an integer, it will just truncate everything after the decimal place. Just disappears like it never existed. Okay, so you have to keep that in mind if you're using parse float, parse int. Now, that being said, again, this is one of those things that it's like the first time I've ever used them because I never use them. If I need to cast to a number, I just cast with number. I've never ever actually done this way. All right, let's move to step 4. Any questions about the parsing functions? No? Okay, cool. Let's go to another one. We'll take a look at the number verification functions. I'm not writing things where they need to be written. That's why I'm skipping what looks like a whole bunch of steps. But I'm not. We're going to step 4a. Check if not a number. Okay, so let nanny equal 3.14 things. Nanny equals is nan. Nanny. Console.log. Type of nanny Danny. Is nan and is finite are ways for us to verify whether something is a number or whether something is finite, meaning not infinite, right? What do you think, what data type do you think is nan returns? Yeah, a Boolean. It returns a Boolean because that's basically what you're asking. Is it nan? Well, if you ask somebody that, they're either going to say yes or they're going to say no, right? They're not going to give you 5. Right? It's not going to happen. So if we refresh, we get number, right? Wait, what? Now it is doing exactly that. No, it's not console logging it out. That's the problem. We're getting line 56, and for some reason, oh, helps if you save. There we go. Boolean true. Broke my brain for a second there. I was like, you do get 5. All right, let's do the other one. Let's check if it's infinite. I had a student on Tuesday argue about this one. 3 divided by 0. And he said, you can't divide 3 by 0. Well, you can. You totally can. In the really real world, you can divide 3 by 0. In computer world, you cannot divide 3 by 0. Unless you are JavaScript. So finite equals is finite. Finite. Let's pass it the finite. For those of you that are curious what finite means, it means it's not infinite, right? It has a set range of value. Console.log, type of, finite, finite. And if I refresh, Mandar, I get back my Boolean, right? Boolean, false, because 3 divided by 0 is technically infinite, because 0 can go into 3 an infinite number of times. I mean, you can divide that in there infinitely, because you're dividing nothing into a number, which just goes infinite. So that is a plausible thing. That is an important concept to also keep track of, because most languages, they will blow up. If you attempt to divide 0 into a number, it will blow up. It will tell you this is not a thing. You cannot do this thing. You will wind up throwing an exception. In JavaScript, though, you don't. So that's something to keep in mind. It won't throw a JavaScript error. Instead, why don't we just comment out this part here so we can actually see what our result is, okay? We get back a number, and the number is infinity. Just to keep in mind.
Can we compare this to infinity?
Let's check. Can I compare infinity to infinity? Yeah, you can.
That's true.
Yeah. Nan is not equal to nan, but infinity is equal to infinity. That's good to know. All right, I'm going to put this back in because it's not going to break anything. Now we're going to talk about the ultimate evil eval. And we're going to write a little story. Okay? So you got to follow along. You got to write out this story. Here's our story. Eval, okay, that's our function that we're going to call. We're going to write console.log with a set of brackets. This is just a string. You might be a bit confused because we wrote console.log. In the real world, if I wrap console.log in quotations, does it execute? No, because it's a string, right? It's just me writing console.log literally. In the eval world, that's not exactly the case. So I'm going to add some quotes in there, and then we're going to write our little story. Here's how our story goes. Hello, I am the evil eval who will allow parsing strings as code. I am slow and can be very dangerous as I run on the user's machine. Let's escape that shit. User's machine using their privileges. See why that's dangerous, right? do not use me when parsing user input. Do not use me to execute third-party scripts. That's the rules for eval. I've included inside there a nice little YouTube video. It is general consensus that using eval is evil, and that is flat. People say, do not use eval. Just flat, right? Just like global variables, everybody says, do not use global variables. Nobody really gives a reason why. They just say, don't use this thing. Eval is evil in those two scenarios. Parsing user input, which you have no control over, right? And you're doing it on the user's machine with their privileges, so you need to be careful. So just don't. If you're parsing user input, you're not using eval for that purpose. And also, when you are including a third-party script, if you were executing eval on that third-party script, then, yep, it's all your problem at that point. You need to be careful with these things. There are times that eval works in some scenarios, but we do have alternatives. We can call function. We can call a whole bunch of different things. Eval is really a last resort. It's an absolute last resort when we absolutely need it. Last week, we looked at destructuring a little bit, and somebody in the class asked me if we could dynamically create variables. Does anybody remember who that was? I don't remember who that was. It was you. I found a way to do it using eval. So let's walk through that. I'll show you how to do this. So let my dyne vars. These are going to be my dynamic variables that I'm going to create on the fly. Need some values to store inside these dynamic variables. So we'll create another array called values. Only this one will actually put some values into it. I'll put 1479 into it. Now I'm going to iterate through those values. Let I equal 0. If I is less than values.length, I plus plus. How many times is this going to iterate? 4. Yeah, 4 times. Now I'm going to push my dyne vars. I'm going to use some dirty backticks and do some string interpolation. I, $, I. What are my 4 values going to be in my dyne vars? Anybody want to take a guess? Close, very close. Not just 0, 1, 2, 3, but specifically I0, I1, I2, I3, right? And we need the I. Why do we need the I? Right, exactly. We can't have variables starting with a number, right? So we need some sort of letter. So are these variables yet? No, they are not. What are they?
They're just strings.
They're just strings. All we've done is throw in a bunch of strings inside my dyne vars. We've basically loaded it up with values. Let's make those things not strings. Let's add some ticks. Eval just accepts a string. That's its only argument. You give it a string. If it contains a JavaScript expression, it will execute the JavaScript expression at the user's privilege level. Okay? If you don't give it an expression it can evaluate, I think it just returns false. Let's check that. No, it actually does evaluate it and return it. Good to know. So eval will throw an exception if you're not careful. All right, let's change my dyne vars into variables using destructuring. I'm going to say var. You can say let if you want to. Destructuring syntax for taking an array of values and assigning them to an array of variable names is square brackets, whatever, equals square bracket, whatever. Okay? So let's just write that in there because the stuff going in the middle, it's a little bit more complex. It gets harder to read. So we'll just flesh that out. Inside the first set of square brackets and the second set of square brackets, I'm going to add a $sign and a set of curly braces, right? When we're using backticks, what is this syntax for? Interpolation, exactly. It's going to evaluate that expression and return it back. So now we're just going to simply go my dyne vars dot, and we're just going to call to string on it. When we call to string, it literally takes all the values in the MyDime vars, returns them back as a string, separated by commas, right? On the other side, we can say values.toString and do the same thing. That expression, why don't we console.log? You know what? We're going to change this up just a little bit. Let code equal. I'm going to take that whole expression out of the eval and put it right there. And then I'm going to console.log code. Just to show you what's going to happen, I'm going to click refresh. That's the expression that's going to wind up executing. Var I0, I1, I2, I3 is equal to 1, 4, 7, 9. That's a destructuring sentence. I just dynamically created 4 variables and made them equal to 4 values. Now I can pass code to eval, like so. And just to demonstrate that that actually worked, let's console.log I0, I1, I2, I3. And we'll refresh, and we get 1479. Dynamic variables. On the fly. I am not sure of another way to do that. If you wanted to create dynamic variables, I have no idea how you could do that without eval. Eval is the best way for me to do that. That being said, in the God knows how many years I've coded in JavaScript, I've had no reason to create dynamic variables. I always find another way, right? So I have never really used eval. In fact, writing eval, I've only done in this class because I've never had a reason to use it. It just never a purpose for it for me. But at least you know it exists. And it's another one of those methods. Eval is a window thing, right? Why don't we show everything that we have available on window? If you go to your browser, in Chrome, on a Mac, if you hit Control-L, it clears out the console for you. On Mac, it's Command-L. Or sorry, Command-K. If I do, just type window by itself and hit enter, that will spit out the window object for us in the console. And then we can go look at all of the methods and properties we have available to us at kind of that global level. And there's a lot of them. There's alert, right? We called that. There's confirm right there. We also have fetch. Fetch is used for like doing API calls now. No more do we have to use crazy syntax to do AJAX calls. Now with fetch, we can just use fetch. Probably one of the reasons you don't need jQuery at all anymore. You'll also notice that all 4 of our variables are sitting there because they immediately get attached as properties to the window object. We have our height and width, which are just basically properties of window objects. There's a lot of information in here. There's a lot of different pieces that you can attach to. Tons and tons of different stuff, all attached to the window object. In addition, because we have jQuery actually attached to our particular thing, jQuery applies itself as a function. It adds the $sign function to the window object to make it available at the global level as well. Cool. Let's make a race. And then we'll take bets. All right. Const, I'm kidding. We're not taking bets. Const 1 equals, they don't pay me enough to take bets. Document.query selector. What does query selector do? That's right. Selects a DOM element. Everybody should know that. Let's change the next one to box 2. So I've grabbed the 2 elements from the page. How am I grabbing these elements? What am I using to grab the elements? What's that? Yeah, the query selector, but what is my selection? What is this thing? Yeah, it's the ID. It's the ID of the element that we've attached to the element. We can prove that. If we open up the index.html, there it is right there, box 1, box 2. Those are both IDs. It's the same as grabbing anything with CSS. That's what you provide to the query selector, is that same query, right? I think in lab 1, it says grab the H2 from origin. And that query selector would look like hashtag origin space H2. That would grab the H2 from that element. It's just a CSS selector. But it makes things really simple for us. It also means that we don't need jQuery, right? Because that was one of the many powers of jQuery. We could use CSS selectors to grab elements from the DOM. Instead of using get element by ID, get element by class, or get element by tag, which were not exactly as flexible as the query selector is. The other cool thing about the query selector versus the jQuery selector, if the element doesn't exist on the page, it doesn't throw an exception. It won't throw any error. It's just null. It's just undefined. There's just nothing inside of it, right? So you don't have to worry that you're accessing something on the page that doesn't necessarily exist. It doesn't break it. Let's do the next piece. Let's create a starting position. So let POS equals 0. Then we'll define the finishing line, right? The finishing line is just another element. It's right over here. Just so we don't have to jump back to index.html to see what it is, you can always right-click on whatever the element is, click Inspect, and it will show you under the Elements tab in your browser where the element is. So I can see, oh, it's div. It's got an ID called finish. That's cool. So in here, now I can type in, I'll just call it finish as a variable name. You can call it whatever you want. Document.query selector hashtag finish. And when I'm done, I can jump back to my console to see any errors that might get spit out. Now for you math whizzes in here, this is, I don't know why I called this accelerate, because it's not really an accelerate function, but we're going to create a function called accelerate. Please don't judge. Function accelerate. Let speed, we're going to make it random. And we're going to round it to 2 decimal places. And then we're going to return it. How can I tighten that up?
Return math round.
Exactly. Just return the math round. We don't need to create a variable. We don't need to do any of that. We can literally just return that. And I think that kind of throws newer JavaScript programmers off if you're coming from a strict language. Because you're so used to defining a variable and then assigning the value to the variable and then returning that variable. So this is, to some people, feels hacky. But it's not. This is more efficient, right? Because now I don't need to store this piece of information, useless information, in memory when I'm literally going to return it, and then the garbage collector is going to immediately get rid of it, right? Why go through the extra steps? Might as well just make it nice and quick and efficient. Next, create a function to trigger the race. Sounds good. Function, start, race. There we go. I'm just going to pop off that closing curly brace. Using intervals, loop through every 30 milliseconds. So the window object has another method on it, right, called set interval. Set interval is really cool. What it basically does is it executes a callback every set period of time that you define. The important thing to understand about set interval is it doesn't execute immediately. It executes after that interval of time has occurred. So if you set it for a second, it won't execute the data inside, the expressions inside, until 1 second has passed. Then it will execute, then it will wait another second, execute, wait another second, execute. That's the way it works. So if you need to execute that information right away, then you need to call it before the set interval. That being said, we're going to create a set interval function for ourselves and use it to basically animate. We're going to animate the little boxes so they move across the screen. Oh, I called that wrong. It's var interval ID. Sorry. Set interval returns a value. It returns an identifier, basically a very unique ID that relates to itself. And the reason why we need that identifier is because set interval will go forever. It will never stop. It will just keep executing. Even if we put if conditions in there, right? If we put a bunch of if conditions that say don't execute this unless this is met, that's fine, but it doesn't stop set interval from executing. It's still going to continue to run itself every single time in memory. It's just going to keep doing it over and over and over again. Just because you're not outputting anything to the screen doesn't mean you're being inefficient. Clear interval is the wonderful, sister to this operation, I guess, that allows us to get rid of set interval when we're ready to. So we need to be able to store the set interval ID, so we're going to store it in the interval ID. Step 6G, the for each box. We're going to use the wonderful ES5 version of this, I'm just going to create box 1 and box 2 array right inside there. I'm just going to create an array and throw in the 2 elements that we selected from the DOM, put them right in there. Why do I need a variable? There's no reason, right? I don't need something else just to pass those in. I'm going to create my curly brace. My ID is going to be nice and friendly and immediately put the closing one in for me. Don't worry, we'll close it all up when we're done here. All right, we're going to check the box offset. So just like window, right? If we look at window, window's got a bunch of different properties in it. I don't know if it has offset. I don't think it does. Yeah, it doesn't have offset, but it has a lot of other different properties. However, we can take a look at box 1. Let's take a look at box 1. Oh, we need to dir that. So I'm going to do dir box 1 so I can see the properties in it. There we go. And if I scroll, there's a few pieces of information. There's client height, which tells me the size of the box. Client width, which tells me the width of the box. However, client left and client top are not necessarily accurate because they're in relation to the client itself, the client being the box. So the left is at the 0 point, and the top is at the 0 point of the box itself, not to the window. If I want to know where they are in relation to the window, I have to go to offset left, and you'll notice it's 10. 10 is reference to pixels. Okay, so it's 10 pixels over from the left side of the window, and the top is 10 pixels down from the top of the window. So what I want to know is basically if the offset of this has crossed the offset of this, kind of like a collision detection. So I know whether or not we've crossed the finish line, right? So I'm going to need an if condition. So if box.offsetLeft is less than finish.offsetLeft, which means this button, this edge corner, is currently on this side of the finish line. Once it's greater than that corner, it'll be on the finish line. That's usually when it triggers. So not after the finish line. If we wanted to do that, we'd have to add on the width of the finish line in order to get that. Actually, not to blow your brain, the height, because I turned them. So it's actually the height of the finish line. All right, step I, 6I. We're going to add to our position the value of the accelerate function. So every time accelerate is going to return a value anywhere from 1 to 10. And we're going to basically add that onto the position each time, each iteration, which will keep moving our object along the page. Yeah, it actually goes really fast. And it's kind of jumpy because set interval is not really the best for this. It's better to use window animation frames. But all right, step 6J. Add it to the styles. Okay, cool. So box style. Style is a property of box. It's essentially where you find your CSS selectors and stuff. Left is just the CSS operation on it. Equals. We'll use some dirty backticks. Box.offsetLeft. Add the position to it. And then, unfortunately, the reason why we're using string interpolation here is because CSS doesn't understand just this flat number without a unit. It needs a unit, right? So whether that's EMs, whether that's REM, whether that's EH, or whether that's pixels, which are more common, we have to give it some kind of unit, so we're going to give it pixels. That's why we're using string interpolation, so that we can add pixels to this equation. Underneath that, we're ready to write our else statement. There we go. Else, we're going to tell the second player they've lost. Don't ask me to explain this logic, just accept that it works. I have no idea. I tried to figure out why this is the case because it felt so opposite to what I thought was happening, but we'll say they lost. Second player, you lost. It works out. Step 6L. Because we are done, we've finished our iterations, one of the boxes is over, we need to stop the loop. And the reason why we want to stop the loop is so that we're not, executing in memory for no reason, right? Just taking up space, doing nothing, right? Let's get rid of it. We don't need it anymore. Let's get rid of it. Let the garbage collector pick it up. Clear interval, and we pass it the interval ID. And then last but not least, we're going to break from the loop so that it doesn't go back around again and execute the loop a second time. Because even if we clear the interval, it will still finish its execution. So we'll break. As soon as we're done this, we will actually take a real break. Now let's make sure we get in all of these wonderful curly braces. There's a whole whack of them. Got some stuff that needs to come up. Just under step 6N, we're going to create a curly brace. And this is the curly brace for the set interval function, right? Set interval takes 2 arguments. The first is the callback function that you want to call. The second is the delay, the number of milliseconds you want to wait before you move on to the next step. We're going to say 30. That seems to be the smoothest. And then we're ready to close off the whole function. That's quite a bit of stuff. I'll let you finish writing that out. I don't know why I walk all the way over there when this is like right here. I don't know. Just like going that way. I'm a lefty kind of guy. Refresh my browser. I've got no errors. That's good. But we haven't called the function anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference. Now, this is ready to go. I can click go, and it will execute. You may be like, well, we didn't add an event listener, so how is that working? And the way it's working is we did actually add an event listener. You just didn't see it because we didn't do it together. Here's the event listener right here. This is an inline event listener. This is not best practice by any means. It's better to keep your JavaScript out of your HTML as much as possible. But I want to show you the multiple different ways of doing event binding, and this is another one. This binds to the attribute onClick, which is onButton, and I pass it the start race, which I'm pulling back from my main.js script that I've included to the HTML page. When I click this button, it will execute this function. That function will execute. So let's take a look at that. I click go. There they go. P1 won. P2 lost. I don't have a reset, so you have to refresh to reset. Click go. Bam. P1 lost this time. The cool thing about this is it's responsive. So if we want to make our track longer, we can just literally drag this out. There we go. Now our track's a little longer. Click go. Takes a little longer for them to get there. There we go. We can also make the track really small. Let's refresh. Whew. Responsive racing. I can see it being the wave of the future. hold on 1 second before I help you. We have a little bit more to finish off with set timeout and a couple other pieces. We'll do that after you get back after the break. But why don't we take 15 minutes? You guys can clear your heads, and then we'll come back and we'll start. Does anybody have any questions about anything we've learned currently that isn't helping you troubleshoot your code? No? Okay. Those who don't need troubleshooting, feel free to go take your break. Those who need troubleshooting, I'll give you a handout. There we go. So we have a couple of more steps. We have 7 and 8, and one of them is fun. Well, kind of fun. Not as fun as the race, I guess. Let's. I don't know why I have this ridiculous amount of code here. Let's tighten this up a little bit because it seems bizarre. All right, step 7. Step 7, we're going to set a timeout. So set interval, right, iterates over and over again. It loops. So it will keep calling itself until you clear it. Even if you're not outputting code to the screen, even if you're not really doing anything, if you've defined set interval and you have it running, it will be running in memory till the end of time unless you clear that thing. Set timeout only executes once. It will only ever execute once. It won't execute more than once. The thing about set timeout, though, is set timeout executes after a set period of time. It's a way to delay it. So you can say, I want to wait 2 seconds and then spit something out to the screen. So let's do that now. We'll do ms equals 0, like so. What am I doing here? Why is this so ridiculously complex?
Just be like that.
I apologize. We're gonna wing this one because that is ridiculously complex. All right, we're gonna create a set timeout. Set timeout, just like set interval, takes 2 arguments. One is the callback function that you want to execute. The other is the number of milliseconds that you want to wait before you execute that callback function. So we pass it a function. We're going to pass it what's called an anonymous function. We've been using these a lot. We haven't really talked about them. We're going to talk about them in a few minutes when we look at building our own functions. But this is called an anonymous function. Why is it called an anonymous function? Because it's got no name. That's why it's called an anonymous function. So we'll just console.log some message. Hey there. Hey there. And then, like I said, it receives 2 arguments. This is where I think a lot of people get kind of stuck on these things with callbacks. They're like, where does the other argument go? Like, where do I put it? Believe it or not, that whole function we just passed was argument 1. Now we're on to argument 2. Let's make this execute after 1,000 milliseconds. Don't get nervous. 1,000 milliseconds is only a second in time. Let's refresh our browser. Wait for it. Hey there. You can make it worse. Let's make it 5 seconds. That way you can see more of the delay. Wait. There it goes. Hey there. Set timeout is really good because JavaScript moves asynchronously, right? If we want to do cool things like, I don't know, maybe you want to beep to the screen. You know what? Let's take a preview. I'm going to be really nice to you, and you're going to see a preview of next week's lesson. Comp 1073, weekly lessons, week 6, live server. Has anybody actually set up the live server yet? Following the things? No? Have you? Yeah. Works nice, eh? It's pretty cool for being able to move things through. All right, here's next week's. We're going to build this thing next week. It's Simon. I got to turn the volume up at least a little bit. There it is. Right? So when you click start, this is set timeout that's doing this. Set timeout runs through the pattern and executes them after a set period of time. So if I get 2 in a pattern, the way JavaScript works, it'll literally fire both of them at the same time due to asynchronicity, right? So if I have 6 different sounds in my pattern, it's going to fire all 6 sounds at the exact same time. It gets really bad when you got like 100 sounds and they all come at once. So I use set timeout to put a delay between each of the times it does it. So now there's a slight second between them. Every time it adds a new one to the pattern. And set timeout creates the delay between them so that we don't wind up with all of them coming at once, making it an unbearable game to play. We're going to build that next week. So we can learn event binding. Cool. Don't get nervous. It's actually really simplistic. It's about like 80 lines of code. It's not really that bad. All right. So set timeout. That's exactly what I'm using set timeout for. You can use set timeout for a bunch of different things. And just like set interval, you can clear set timeout. So maybe you have a delay before you want to do something. Give the AI some time to think something through. And then you're like, nope, dude hit a button. So no, we're going to clear that out. You can do that kind of thing if you want to. All right, let's code the kind of semi-complex version of set timeout. So the semi-complex version of set timeout is, let's first create a millisecond block. Next, we're going to create an interval and set it to interval ID. Set interval. Set interval takes a function as a callback, and its second argument is the amount of time that we want to wait. We're going to wait 100 milliseconds. So every 100 milliseconds, we're going to execute this thing, right? We're going to add 100 to milliseconds, and then we're going to console.log ms. Oh, now I know why I did this. Now it all comes together and makes sense. The reason why I'm doing this is I'm using set interval to show you how the timeout works in set timeout so that you can see that it does happen at the time it's told to. Okay? So set interval will actually show us the number of milliseconds that has passed before set timeout is actually executed. That's what we're using this little wonderful thing for. All right, let's create a function. We're going to call it greet. And we're going to pass it a message called greeting. We're going to console.log out greeting. And once we're actually finished consoling it out, I'm going to clear my interval so it doesn't execute any more times by passing it the interval ID. Okay. Nothing new. Might seem a little complex because we've written a few more lines together, but the set interval is a lot simpler than the set interval we did before. All we're doing is literally every 100 milliseconds, we add 100 milliseconds to ms, and then we console.log it out. Then we do it again, add again, add again, each time. Now we can call set timeout. You can call set timeout with the anonymous function, like so, or you can pass it what's known as a function definition. I've talked about these before. Does anybody remember the difference between a function definition and calling a function? What's that?
Function definitions like defining a function, like
Yep.
creating what it does.
So what is the important syntax characters that I need in order to call the function versus passing in the definition?
Just the function name.
Close. There's one more piece.
Function call, calling a function.
Yep. There's something at the end of the function definition that you have to pass, like you have to put at the end of it. Arguments, dots, not dots. They're half moons, right? Parentheses. That's literally the only difference. And I can show that to you. We created this function called greet here, right? Go in your console for a second. Clear it out. By the way, you can also clear it with this little no smoking sign that's here. The remove sign. I'm going to move this up. When we define things on the left-hand side, like we've done over here, they actually become available over here as well. So as long as I refresh, clear this out. Yeah, stop. Stupid thing. That would be called an infinite loop. You know what? Before we do that, let's just finish this off real fast. We're going to pass our function definition at 1,000 milliseconds. And we're going to call hello peeps And then we're going to refresh to stop that stupid thing. And then I'll explain that in 1 second. All right, like I said, we have greet over here. If I call greet like this as a function, I get undefined. And the reason is because it's trying to return something. It doesn't know what to return. It doesn't really have anything to return. I can call greet with the argument in it, hello, and we'll get hello just like it's supposed to. But if I call greet without the parentheses, what I'm now asking for is the function definition. I want the actual code you used to create the function. And when I hit enter, that's exactly what it spits out, right? Notice how that looks exactly like what we wrote right here? Exactly. And the thing is the reason why that's cool is because now I can take this function definition. I can pass it to something that requires a callback. And it won't execute it till it's done doing what it needs to do, and then it will execute. The very cool aspect of that is if I was to pass greet to set timeout with parentheses, does anybody know what will happen?
You just call the function.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It will call greet, right? Return the value back. Then, after 1,000 milliseconds, it will try to fire something off, and it won't work. It will try to fire off the return value of this, which is undefined. So it'll just blow up, right? And we can see that. If we go to our greet and we call it that way, and I refresh, I get undefined. And the reason why I'm getting the undefined is because this is executing, and then it's trying to call it, and it can't because there's nothing to call. We didn't actually give it a callback. All we did was give it undefined as a callback, which is not valid. So instead, we give it the callback definition, which is just removing the parentheses. Now when I refresh, it goes through the iteration, and then I get the hello peeps. All right, let's talk about this code a little bit. Set interval is doing what it does best. It's just looping through. After 100 milliseconds, it's going to spit console.log out to the screen. Every 100 milliseconds, it's going to keep doing that. It's going to do that for an infinite amount of time, as we saw, right? It will just keep doing it forever. If I don't want it to do it forever, then I have to make sure I clear it. So we created a little function called greet. We console.log the greeting. Then we clear the interval when we're done, right? Our set timeout is going to call this function. This is the 1,000 milliseconds I want to wait. So for 1,000 milliseconds, I'm going to do nothing. Nothing at all. For 1,000 milliseconds. After the 1,000 milliseconds, I'm going to execute this function. So you may be asking, what is this? That is my parameters. Those are my arguments. I want to pass an argument to greeting. I need to do it in some way. I can't call the function, so I can't pass the arguments that way. How do I get them in there? Everything after these two arguments is treated as a parameter list. It's treated as an argument list. It's getting passed to whatever function it is you're calling. You can add as many of them as you want, as long as the function supports them. And so on and so forth. In addition to set timeout, you obviously have clear timeout as well. Let's get rid of that junk that we just put in there so we don't wind up with errors. There we go. We also have clear timeout. Clear timeout, let's create a timeout ID just like we do with set interval. We're going to say set timeout greet. Let's make it after 2,000 seconds so that we don't interact with the thing. And I'm going to write I love soup. Actually don't. I really hate soup. I just hate it because it's messy. I don't know what it is about it, but I'm just a terrible eater. I think that's the problem. I'm a terrible eater. I'm going to use an anonymous function this time. And just to demonstrate that it really is legitimately two arguments, I'm just going to put a comma before I define it and add 1,500. So when is my set timeout going to... Yeah, when is this second set timeout going to execute? When's this one going to execute? How many seconds?
It's not gonna execute.
It's not going to execute anything, but when will it not execute it?
After timeout.
Yep, after 1.15 seconds. Right. So this is going to fire off before or after line 169. Is this going to execute before or after this line? How many people say before? And how many people say after? Okay. So the cool thing is, because JavaScript is asynchronous, this will 100% execute before the other line, because it's going to execute at 1500 seconds on, or sorry, 1500 milliseconds on the computer clock. This is going to execute at 2000 milliseconds on the computer clock. Does anybody know how accurate that is? Because it's not 100% accurate, unfortunately. You can't rely on them to occur at exactly those points, because there's other things that can happen. There's things that can cause it to screw up, right? Your processor can be sucked up with something else. There's a whole bunch of things that can occur to cause those times not to work out. But let's pretend that everything is golden and we're okay. We're in a Goldilocks zone right now. Let's add some actual actions inside our function. First thing we're going to do is clear timeout, and we're going to pass it this timeout ID that we're storing of the other timeout function. There we go. And then we're going to console.log, and this might be generational. Some of you might know this. No soup for you. Let's take a look at these functions around 168 to 173. Does anybody want to give me an idea of what's going to happen? And you tell me what is going to occur.
No soup for
100%. We're going to wind up with no soup for you. 169 is going to get registered into memory. The interpreter is going to say, haha, in 2000 milliseconds, I'm going to execute that expression. Then this guy's going to come in and say, after 1500 milliseconds, we're going to clear that shit. And we're not going to execute nothing. It's going to disappear. That's going to occur. The garbage collector is going to come in and go beep, 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 and push that out of memory, and it's gone. And we're done. Let's refresh, and we'll see that. Hello, peeps. No soup for you. And that's because we have cleared that interval. It is gone. Sorry, cleared that timeout. It is gone. It's not going to execute. And the whole reason is because this comes before this, right? Remember basic math? This is less than. 1500 is less than 2000, so it happens first. If I wanted it to happen after, I could change this to 3000 milliseconds. Refresh my page. I love soup. And the whole reason is it will still get cleared out, but it doesn't happen until at the 3000 marks. Hence why now we have no soup for you afterwards. Any questions about set interval and set timeout? The cool thing is we're going to be using them often because we're going to make lots and lots of games. So we need some way to do frames. And set interval is a fantastic way to do it. Another way is window animation frames, which we'll also be taking a look at. Window animation frames are a little better. They're a little smoother. All right, one other cool thing before we move on to building our own functions. You can just follow along. Function, the new and improved greeting. And then underneath here, I'm going to call the new and improved greeting. And I'm going to pass it, hello class, what's up? And you have to break it apart or it sounds weird. Oh, I'm giving it away. Home slices. There we go. Now, let's create the greeting. We're going to use something that's built into our browsers called speech synthesis. If your browser does not support it, poor you. Open up Chrome, because it does support it. There we go. That is speech synthesis utterance. That is a mouthful. If you have trouble figuring out what I've typed there, you can always jump over to your console and start typing it in. Speech synthesis utterance, right there. Hit enter, and then just copy and paste that into your thing. It's like an insanely long class name. by far. So we're going to create a new one. Then we're going to go speech synthesis dot speak, and we're going to pass it greeting. And that is it. That's all we need to execute this particular thing. And if you did it correctly, and you click refresh.
Hello, class. Wasps up home slices.
You get a creepy computer voice. Yeah, we'll save those. So also in this lesson under step 9, I have data methods, but we have looked at data methods in this class. The only reason I included them is because the Tuesday class actually lost out on taking a look at filter, map, all those array methods that we have. We also have those. Those are still technically, well, they're methods, but methods are functions, right? And they are available. And you're welcome to look at those, and they are a part of this document. Otherwise, we are ready to move on to making our own functions. We've already been making our own functions. We've been doing it for a long time now. I think class 1 we created our own function, right from the get-go, right? Syntax for functions inside JavaScript is just function, whatever your function name is, whatever your parameter list is, a couple of curly braces, and then some shit in between, right? That you're going to execute when they call that function. That's it. That's all it is. Not very difficult. However, that's a standard syntax function, and we have a lot more functions available to us that we can use that are not necessarily that syntax, including the very cool ES6 arrow functions, which are very, very cool. Nice one-liner functions, which are kind of neat. Anyways, is everybody good? Do you have their speech synthesis? Anybody still typing that out? I'll give you a minute. Those who are not still typing it out, if you go over to Blackboard, go to week 5. I hear something. I hear creepy computer voices. All right. We're going to click on Starter Custom Functions. Go ahead and save that wherever you are comfortable working from. I'm just going to get rid of the zip file. I'm going to pull that into my project folder for now. Jump into it. Move this guy over here for a second. Go to library. Take index, drop it in place. There we go. All right. Can I close this? Is that cool? Everybody good? Awesome. I'll close that out. Going to take a look at the starter custom functions. If you open up the index.html, let's just give it a title. We'll call it custom functions. Hit refresh. Actually, I'm going to change that title. I'm going to call this Marky, Mark, and the function bunch. There we go. That's better. I like puns. Too much, perhaps. When you change the title, you can actually see that you've changed it. It will show up in your tab. The tab now has the Marky Mark and the function bunch. That's about it. I don't think there's anything else in here that I really care about. Nope. Everything else is kind of hooked up for you. So we'll just leave that one, and we'll open up main. Inside there, you're also going to notice there is a other file called main-backup.js, or sorry, -js, and it contains a ton of different things, including talking about callbacks in depth, promises, asyncs, stuff like that. I went a little too far, and then I was like, no, let's scale that way back. So we'll talk about promises and async await when we start talking about APIs, because then it'll become very important, and you'll need to understand those things. But for now, that is there. I was going to just delete it, but then I thought some of you are trying to look to challenge yourselves further, and if that's the case, that's a good file to take a look at and learn how to do those things and what they do. All right, we're going to harness some elements. The first thing I want to do is grab the thing result. Thing result actually shows up here on the page. I'm going to call it thing result equals document.query selector. And it's hashtag thing result. Hashtag thing result. I mean, we've coded, I don't know how many functions already. We've done it so many times. But repetition is supposed to help lend to memory. So we're going to do it one more time. Function, we're going to call this norm func syntax for normal function syntax. Or standard. I would say it's standard. We're going to give it 2 parentheses afterwards. These parentheses are where we put our parameters, right? What's the difference between parameters and arguments? You don't know? Parameters are what we define in our function as placeholders. Those are parameters. Arguments are what we pass to the function when we call it. That's the difference. So we're going to create a parameter list in there in 1 second, but we're just going to finish off our syntax. That's our normal function syntax. The keyword function to tell the interpreter that we're creating a function. Norm func syntax, which is the symbol name that we're using. The parameter list, which we don't have one yet because we just included the brackets, but you need the brackets either way. And then the curly braces. And the curly braces are a block that basically wrap all of our function expressions that we're going to write inside there. Let's give it some parameters. Param1, param2, and then we're going to create a default parameter. Default param equals default parameter value. I spelled that wrong, didn't I? No, I did not. Value. Default parameters are really cool because sometimes you don't necessarily need all 3 parameters to be filled, right? You don't need 3 arguments for 3 parameters. You might only need 2 of them. And the other one, you have a default backup, right? You see that quite often. If you take a look at function definitions in documentation for Java, C++, so many different languages, you will see that they have default parameters in there with default values already inside them so that you only have to pass the first argument or the second argument. And you don't need all the other ones because they already have values in place. That's the same thing here. We have to pass parameter 1. We have to pass parameter 2. Those are required. We don't have to pass parameter 3 because we have a default value in place. Let's just make this very simple. Console.log, param1, param2, param3. Sorry, default param. Helps if we call it what it is. Step 1a, call the function by passing only 2 arguments. All right, so our function's name is norm func syntax, and when I want to call it, I pass the 2 parentheses, the opening and closing parentheses. Those opening and closing parentheses say, hey, interpreter, call this function, execute, invoke this function, whatever word you want to use that helps you understand that we're calling it. Then we're going to pass it the arguments. Argument 1, argument 2. I realize those are boring, but I'm going for verboseness. If I refresh, I get argument 1, argument 2, and the default parameter. And the reason I get the default parameter is because I've set the default parameter. It has a value, so it spits it out. Let's call that function again. This time, we're going to override the default parameters. So norm func syntax, argument 1, oops, argument 2, and override value. Now when I click refresh, instead of the default parameter value back, I get override value instead. Override value You've used default parameters before, right? Many of you have? Yeah? I feel like Thursday is the new Friday at 5. I don't know why. I just feel like it is.
Thursday feels more like Mondays.
It does. I'm trying to get tomorrow off because it's a long weekend. I don't want to work tomorrow. All right. Using the standard function syntax, so using that stuff we just learned, we're going to do an event listener, and we're going to bind that to thing1 button. So let's do that. So function thing1 function thing1 action. There's our very normal syntax, very boring syntax. We're going to use thing result, which is this thing we did up here. Right? We're going to now hijack that HTML element, and we're going to change its text content to equal thing1 says, I have done a thing. Cool. Next, we're going to call our function thing1 action with the parentheses. And that's it. We've called this function. It's not bound to the button yet, though, right? So if I click the button, it does nothing. I can click all day. It does absolutely nothing because we haven't actually bound anything to it. We haven't created the event listener. All we've done is call the function. All right. PHP supports anonymous functions. JavaScript supports anonymous functions. Few languages support anonymous functions. Not many, but JavaScript and PHP I know do for sure. Anonymous function is just a function without a name. It is anonymous. It's alone in its parent's basement doing creepy shit on the internet. Let's create one of these creepy anonymous functions. We're going to create a variable called anon func syntax, short for anonymous function syntax. And we're going to make it equal to an anonymous function. Function, no name, right? If you put a name, then you're breaking the whole idea of anonymous function. We're going to give it a parameter 1, parameter 2, but we're going to make the parameter 2 default, and we're going to give it a value of anonymous, not anonymous, anonymous. Still need the curly braces to encapsulate the expression, though. And then we'll just console.log param1 and param2. God, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this in one line and not have to do it in 3? That would be beautiful. That's foreshadowing at its best, by the way.
Really,
So subtle, eh? Anon func, we're going to call it, and we're going to pass it we are. Now when we refresh, we get we are anonymous, right? Because we have this wonderful default value. I'm excited because Saturday I'm going to see Venom. So we're going to pass in this time we are, and the second parameter will be Venom.
hopefully it's good.
And if we click, according to IGN, it is terrible. But I'm going to see it anyways. So we are
IGN is a
Venom.
games review site,
They do movies too.
but they're games review site.
Now they're multimedia.
Now they're multimedia.
Yeah.
They're a games review site, and they're not even good at that.
The anonymous function is our bread and butter. We pass the anonymous function to callbacks, right, when we don't want to actually have to create a function and give it a symbol name. Anonymous functions are great because they encapsulate scope for us. We keep scope within inside them. We can use them immediately, but we don't need to inflict memory with them. We don't need to take up valuable space in memory with this function if we're only ever going to use it once. Because essentially what's going to happen, the garbage collector, when we give it an anonymous function, it's going to fire off that function, and then the garbage collector is going to come and scoop up all that crap and throw it out. If we define it in memory and say this function exists, it has a name, it will remain until it loses scope. right? Which means it stays around a lot longer. Anonymous functions are very, very valuable. You're going to see a lot of them. When you start looking at other people's code, you're going to see anonymous functions because that tends to be one of the things a lot of people do. They use anonymous functions. So let's use an anonymous function, the syntax we just created. This time we're going to create a thing2 action equals function. And we'll say thing result dot text content is equal to thing2 says I have done a thing. I mean, you can copy and paste. They're basically going to say the same thing every time. Then we want to call it. Calling it is very easy. We just call it the same way we call any of them. Thing2 action with parentheses. And if that all works out, when you click refresh, it should say thing2 says I have done a thing. But once again, this is not connected to the button. None of these buttons work yet because we haven't done anything to them yet. There's no event binding on them. It's not magic. We don't create functions and then all of a sudden immediately get event binding. Now once again, like I said, when it's only one expression, why can't I write this in a single line? Well, I can. Technically, I could have written any of these. Like, if I wanted to do it, I could do const my func equals function console.log. Hey there. But yes, it's single line, technically, right? It's not a very attractive way to do it. It looks kind of janky, I would say that. I would much rather use the wonderful arrow functions. Arrow functions are fantastic. Arrow functions can be written the way you're used to writing them. You can write them almost like you write a anonymous function. So we'll say this one is called arrow syntax. Arrow func syntax equals, I'm going to give a parameter list. Notice I didn't write the keyword function. I literally just threw some parameters inside a set of parentheses. I'm going to say awesome. It's awesome. Now when I want to actually execute the block, I can't just throw a block at the end of it. Instead, hence the name, I have to create an arrow. Some languages, they call this a fat arrow, right? And if anybody's ever coded in CoffeeScript, they call it a fat arrow. Fat arrow has different context than a thin arrow. Then we can give it the block. What this basically says is, hey, take these things and pass them to the block. Does anybody know what the word is for that structure? It starts with an L. L.
Lambda.
Lambda. It's a lambda. Arrow functions are lambda. And just like lambdas, they maintain the context of this based on their current scope, which is really cool. They don't change their scope based on that. We will talk more about this scope later on when we deal with objects. Yeah.
Is that why it's technically defined as a constant?
Doesn't matter. We're only defining it as a constant because we're not going to overwrite arrow func syntax. We could call it let if we wanted to. We could do var. We could do it globally if we wanted to. Doesn't really matter. I just use const. My brain immediately goes to const when I know I'm not modifying the value. So I immediately go to const because it's better for memory. Allocates a set amount of space. It doesn't allocate a ton of space for it. Don't wind up with a ton of copying and pasting all over the place in memory. Step 5a. Let's call this thing. Arrow func syntax. Arrow functions are. Now when we refresh, we get arrow functions are awesome. But I promised you single line. Nice, pretty, single line syntax, right? No brackets, nothing else. If you have one expression and you only have one expression, or you're returning a single value, and that is it, you're not doing anything else with your function, you can write this all in one beautiful line. Let's create arrow func2. Sorry, let's create it with the proper syntax. Const arrowfunc2 equals, let's do param1, param2. So far, exactly the same as the other one. Whoops. So I'm just going to make my screen a little bigger so you can see this on one single line. Create the fat arrow. And then I don't need the block. I am not required to put the block in if I'm returning back a single expression. I can just write it. Console.log, param1, param2. Just like that. I'm never going to require you to have to use this syntax. Like, granted, if it shows up in a lab, you have to use the syntax. But I'm saying, when you build out your own assignments and stuff like that, if you don't want to use the arrow function syntax, you are welcome not to use it. That's totally up to you. But to me, I love this because it's very quick, it's very simple, it's straightforward. I know exactly what's happening. It's readable. It's very readable to me. I like this format. Probably because I'm a Ruby developer. I'm all about readability over just conventions, right? So I like how this works. I'm just going to half cut my screen and refresh. Arrow functions are awesome, so now I need to call this thing. Let's call it arrowfunc2. Arrow functions are, and why don't we override that wonderful default, and we'll say interesting, which is probably what many of you are thinking. And there we go. Arrow functions are interesting. Anybody blatantly not like arrow functions? Yeah, it's just different, right? But JavaScript's different. Using the keyword function is different. Right? When you guys first started with PHP, you had to use that keyword function. That probably threw you off. Because up to that point, you never wrote the word function. You wrote the data type. And then you provided a parameter list, which, believe it or not, is a data type on its own. You provided a parameter list, and then you gave it a block with a bunch of expressions, and that went into memory. You did that in Java. You did that in Objective-C. You'll be doing that in C++ if you take the course. Yeah.
Are there some situations where it wouldn't work with an arrow function?
So the one thing, we will learn this a little bit later, but the one thing about arrow functions to understand is they are not the exact same as a regular function. The context of this, you guys have used this in object-oriented programming, right? The context of this changes. So with functions, regular functions, the context of this is its function. It's within its scope itself, right? If it's a method of a class, the context of this is the class, right? That's the way it works. The arrow function isn't scoped to its immediate embedded function. It's scoped to whatever is out there above it. So you don't, it's hard to explain. It basically means that this, instead of, like if you were to put an arrow function in and you were to create a function above it, this function here, its context of this is within its functional body. The context of the arrow functions, this, is everything outside of it, within whatever scope it's currently in. That's why they're very different. That's why they're very powerful, though, because up to this point in JavaScript, we've had to do something called binding of this, where if I want to maintain the context of this to a certain scope, I had to bind it, and I had to keep binding it every time I needed it. Or we had to do something called this is that. You ever done that before? Where you go that equals this, just so you can keep that context throughout your scopes as you move scopes in. Yeah, we're going to do some of that. We're going to do some of that when we talk about object-oriented programming. It's a bit more advanced, and it's probably stuff that you may not have totally seen. But we'll talk about it then. I don't want to overly confuse you. We were already going to do something very confusing in a minute. All right, so now we are going to create the thing3 action. So let's do that real fast. Const thing3 action equals single line, beautiful arrow function, thing result dot text content is equal to thing3 says I have done a thing. All one line. Granted, the wrapper's wrapping it, but wrap. Once we've actually written that out, we can go ahead and call the thing3 action We just call it like we call anything, thing3, action, bam. And if everything's good and you refresh, you should see thing3 says, I have done a thing. Once again, I know I keep saying this and I sound like a broken record. This is not bound to the button. We have not done any event binding at this point. It's not magic. We don't declare a function and immediately get binding. All right. Ready to have your brains blown a little bit? We're going to talk about callbacks. Callbacks are probably one of the more confusing things. And what I've decided is next week I am going to come armed with an application flow document because when I explained this on Tuesday, my God, did it go south. It's difficult to understand how things are moving through callbacks. It does make sense. And eventually when you get it, you get it. And there's no problem, you have no problem using them. But they can be a bit confusing from the get-go. So first of all, I think one of my issues was I used an arrow function, which kind of made things a little confusing. So this time I'm not going to. I'm going to create a regular syntax function with a parameter called message, like so. And it's going to change the value of thing result. Text content equals that message, right? We all understand what's happening in this function. When I call output and pass it a message, it's going to take the thing result HTML element, access its text content property, and make it equal to this message. These two things are the same thing, right? That's how parameters work. That's the wonderful point of a parameter. A parameter is a placeholder. It is important because we can use the parameter within our code in order to pass arguments to it that we can now use throughout there, right? That's an important thing to understand. You have to understand that concept to understand how callbacks are going to work. That parameter is the same. Message is the same. They don't change between the parameter list and when we call them. They're the exact same thing. Step 3, we're going to create a callback that actually create a function that actually takes a callback as a parameter. Function, callback, func, syntax. So just a regular function, right? We're going to give it a parameter. You can call your parameter whatever you want. It doesn't matter. I'm going to call it callback param. There is no difference between that function definition and the function definition above it. I have not done anything syntactically different. They are exactly the same. There is no difference between those two things. People get hung up on syntax. Don't. This said output and this said message. It's literally the same thing. They are identical structures. The only difference is what we do inside. I'm going to call callback param. And you remember how I told you we can pass things function definitions? What we're going to do with this, guys, we're going to pass it a function definition. How do I call a function definition? Well, it's the very important little piece of syntax I need to call it. Just parentheses. That's all I need, right? So once I have that function definition, I can literally call it with just a set of parentheses. So this callback here, I'm going to pass it a function definition. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to be like, dude, take this. And then it's going to call it inside, just by adding the silly parentheses. That's the only difference. So this piece and that piece are just going to be the function definition argument that I pass in. If I passed in a string, it's not going to work, right? Because we're going to literally try to call the string, which you can't do. You can't call a string. You can see that if you try it in the console, right? If I take this console and I go, hello there, and then add a set of parentheses to it, I get a type error, right? It's not a function. It doesn't exist. You can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. Same thing will happen if I try to call this guy with the same thing. I'm going to save this. I'm going to refresh. And then I'm going to try to call it. So I'm going to say callback func syntax. If I pass it a string, hello, I get a type error, right? But if I give it a function, Yep, as an argument. Because all it is a bunch of expressions. It's just a set of expressions. I'm passing that functional definition into here, and then I'm calling it. That's all I'm doing. I find it's one of those things that's very tricky to wrap your brains around. So let's make this a little bit easier. Let's do console.log callback param in here without the brackets. Okay, that's the first thing we're going to do. And then I'm going to take out that one last piece there. So you can see what's going to happen. There we go. We have callback syntax, right? So I'm going to call it. Let's do callback func syntax. Hey there. And this is going to work just fine, right? It's no different than anything else we've done up to this point. If I refresh, sure enough, I get hey there. Because all I'm doing is calling the function and passing an argument, right? Yes, I get it. I'm kicking a dead horse here. I know that. Now we're going to call it again, but this time we're going to pass an anonymous function to it. The anonymous function, when we pass it to it, is just a function definition. That's all it is. When I go function, like so, I am passing an anonymous function. I'm literally defining the function definition and passing it in. Now I can do whatever I want in here. So why don't I just do console.log Bob. Okay. The thing to understand though is you're not going to see this. This is not going to execute, right?
It will just show the function definition.
Exactly. It's just going to show from this line to this line. It's going to show the function definition and what we're trying to do. So if I refresh, see? It just spits out the function definition. So if you follow logic, I've got the function definition. I know that if I add a set of parentheses to my function definition, I can call it. That tells you now that you have the ability to call this at any point you want. So why don't we do that? Console. Actually, we'll just call it right underneath. Call back func syntax with the brackets. Okay. Now when I refresh, I don't know if it'll let me pass because we'll have a type error. Yeah, we've got a really nasty type error, so we can't call it back that way. We have to get rid of the 86, so we'll just comment it out. And we'll refresh. I crashed my browser. Yep, sure enough, I crashed the browser. Give me 1 second to reload everything. Oops. Desktop.
Divided by 0.
Yeah, it's not happening in a good way right now, that's for sure. I'm doing something silly. Oh, yes, am I ever doing something silly? Do you see what I was doing? I had this. What is that? What is this literally the definition of? It's a recursive function. I'm literally calling itself. It's a recursion. Hence our terrible loop. There we go. I'm here all week, peeps. All right, callback param. That's what we want. Now let's refresh. And sure enough, we get the console, right, shows us the function definition. And when we call it on line 83, we actually see the execution. Okay? How many say callbacks are still really confusing? Okay. That's okay. That is totally fine. We are going to do it literally a bajillion times. We're going to use callbacks constantly because that's the hugest power of JavaScript. And you need it because callbacks give us something that JavaScript takes away. So JavaScript takes away synchronicity, right? We can't guarantee things happen in the order we're expecting, and that's the power of JavaScript. We want that. We want things to happen parallel. So the JavaScript isn't waiting on stuff, it's just moving on with its life. In PHP, if I do an API call, in Ruby, if I do an API call, any language, if I do an API call, I have to wait. The world stops until that response from the server comes back. Correct? Right? You guys ever done API calls in PHP or any other language? You wait. You wait till it happens and it finishes. If they have a slow-ass server on the other end, you wait a slow-ass time, right? Because you can't do anything until it's done. You can't continue to execute your code until it's finished. In JavaScript, that's not the case. JavaScript can reach out, do the API call, and while it's waiting for the response, you can continue on with your code doing whatever it is you want to do. When it's ready and it's done, we need to know that. What do you think we use in order to tell that? Callbacks. Because when it's done, it will execute the callback, and now we know it's finished, and we can execute a block of code based on the fact that it finished. That's the big thing about callbacks. It gives us the ability to take an asynchronous language and still be able to predict when things are finished and still be able to move throughout our code. It's a lot to wrap your head around. I get that. It's totally a lot to wrap your head around. But we're going to do it extensively. All right. We did all through that. I've got 7b. Do I want to make this easy? Yes, I do. I think that's enough. I think we've broken your brain. We'll leave it there. Let's do the binding, and then we'll call it a day. All right? So bindings are very simple. I want to select the things on the page. I'm going to do const thing one button. That selects the button on the page once I do this, document. Dot query selector. Hashtag button thing one. That's the name of the button. Remember, if you don't know what the ID is, you just right-click on it, choose inspect. Oh, look it, the ID is button thing. Let's select the other two that we're going to work with. We're going to select with 2, 2, 3, 3. There we go. We have all 3 now. There's a few different ways to do click events or any type of event binding. One of the ways is by doing onClick as an attribute in the HTML. That is a gross way. Don't do it that way. The better way is to do it right directly in our JavaScript code. Events are always bound on the HTML element itself. It's always bound on an object, right? There's a few different ways we can do it. The one we've done up to this point is add event listener. We've seen that. Event listener takes 2 arguments. Does anybody remember the first argument? What the first argument is? Sorry? Are you saying old value? No, it's the actual event that's going to occur, right? So we're going to say click. So when they click the button, something will happen. The next argument? Yep, anonymous function, the callback function, right? These wonderful things we keep typing. But do I need to actually type it out? I don't, because I already have it, right? Remember, we defined it further up. What did we call it? Thing, one, action. Do I need the parentheses? I don't want them, do I? Because what happens if I keep them there? It calls it and takes the return value and passes it. We don't want that. We want just the function definition. So basically what's going to happen, we've added an event listener to thing one button. The event listener gets added to the event loop, and the event loop's going, hey, what's going on? You've been clicked? No? Cool, I'll wait. You've been clicked? Nope, no, cool, I'll wait. And it just sits there and waits till it happens. Once it happens, it puts it onto the event list, and the event list says, you've been clicked? Oh, you've been clicked. I get to execute your function. So then it goes into thing one action and executes that expression. It calls it immediately. We can see that if we save, refresh our browsers, click thing one, and the text should change. Thing one says, I have done a thing. That's kind of the long syntax. There is shorter syntax. Let's do thing two button. Instead of add event listener, we can actually avoid the whole click part of it by just calling on click, which is a property that exists already. And all we have to do is make it equal to a function definition. That's it. Either we can make it equal to an anonymous function that we create, or we can use one of the function definitions we already created, which was thing two action. If everything is golden and you refresh and you click on two, it should change the text. Thing one, thing 2. We are not limited to click events. Believe it or not, you can create your own event and fire it off whenever you want to. It doesn't have to be a physical thing. You can create an event like, I don't know, Dan's trigger, right? And then when Dan's trigger occurs, everything that subscribes to that event will execute. How many of you have heard of publish subscribe or pub/sub? No? Pub/sub is a very cool computer sciencey thing to learn, but basically the idea is that things subscribe to these events. And then when the event occurs, then they execute their action. When the event is published, the subscribers immediately execute their action. Pub/sub is a very cool concept. And you guys kind of get to see that.
C#.
You did do pub/sub in C#?
Yeah. We had events.
You had events in C#, right. Yeah, and they're essentially the same idea. The idea is you are subscribing to this event. Multiple things can subscribe to the event. The event doesn't care what's subscribed to it. That's the whole point. The event does not care. It's just going to execute. It's going to publish. The subscribers care, because the subscribers are going to execute once the event is published. All right, let's do thing 3 and demonstrate the fact that we don't need to necessarily do an on-click. We can also do on mouse over. And we'll call thing 3 action. This is just a brief introduction to event binding. Next week, we're going to build Simon Says. We're going to get to see tons of event binding. So now when I go over 3, it says thing 3, click, hover, click, hover, click. See how it changes? You can't really see it all that well. Let me make it senior size. There we go. Thing 2, thing 3, thing 2, thing 3, right? There's also mouse down and mouse up. Those are different than click. Mouse down means you push your mouse down and it will fire the event. It doesn't just fire it once, it continually fires it until you get your mouse back up again. Yeah.
So the on click and on mouse over, they don't follow camel case?
Not in this particular instance, no.
So
It's annoying, eh?
is there any reason for it?
I have no idea. I honestly don't know. They're properties, right? So if you were to actually call thing2 button in the browser underneath your console here, and you said thing2 button, only we want to log that out, so let's do console.dir so we get the actual object, and we click it. There we go. Now we can go look. You can also search in here as well. You click inside, and then you can go on click. And there it is. On click. It says it's a function, bizarrely enough, but it's not. It's actually a property that you make equal to a function. Oh, it says it's a function because we bind a function. That's why it says it's a function. It says it's a function because we bound thing2 action to it. All right. You can go find on mouse over. On mouse over. There we go. There's on mouse over. Right? But
anything on plane.
Yep. Yeah, there's tons of them. There's a whole huge list of ons here. Right? On copy is kind of interesting. Did you guys do destructors, constructors, and copy constructors in any of your classes? So when you create objects, they go through these different life cycles, right? When you first create the object, it goes through the constructor life cycle where it actually gets constructed. You can actually, in most languages, you can override the constructor and create your own constructor so things execute the way you want them to. Objects also have destructors. So when they lose scope, it actually fires off the destructor, right? This is in every language. This isn't just JavaScript. This is like in every single language. It fires off the destructor, and the destructor executes and does this stuff of clean. Usually you do garbage cleanup in that spot. And then there's a thing called a copy constructor, which means anytime it moves from a location in memory to another location in memory, it gets copied. And you can actually override the copy constructor and call that. And that's exactly what that thing is. On copy is when anytime it gets copied, it will call the on copy constructor. That's more C++ stuff. Yeah, good.
Is there anywhere that we can do only one on click at a time and not take any on clicks?
Yeah, so jQuery has one, right? But what we can do is we can remove it. So we can say, yeah, let's do something cool. So let's we'll take.
If multiple div items have on click, and if you want to make only one click at once, like before I'm calling the function,
Yeah.
I want to wait till the other user can go pick another div. Is there any way that we can do that?
Yeah, we can use a callback. We can use a callback to state that when this click event has occurred, go ahead and remove the event binding from everything else. We can do that. That's where callbacks come in really handy, right? Because we can actually just call it whenever we want. We have that power. We could also use set interval. We can use anything we want to do the removing. If you're going to use set interval, what you would do is you would create a sentinel variable. You click the button, and you set your sentinel variable to true. And then set interval is polling that, right? Saying, are you true? No? Cool. Are you true? Yep. Oh, you are? Okay, cool. I'm going to go do this now. You can do it that way as well. But callbacks are much faster, much better, more memory efficient in that scenario. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions about any of this stuff? Don't get too hung up on callbacks. We are going to be doing them a lot.
Are we going to get into custom events?
Yeah. Yeah, we will for sure. Yeah, we'll learn custom events as well. How to dispatch events. If that's the keyword. That's the keyword right there. Dispatch events. If you want to jump ahead and learn how to create your own events, dispatch events is what you want to know. Okay? That allows you to create your own event systems. Yeah. Your code? Okay. Other than that, everybody is welcome to leave. I will stick around for at least till 7 or until people disappear. I will help with labs and I will help with assignments. So if you need help, that's the time to take advantage of it. Otherwise, you contact me.